So we got the 4 hip mobility steps for the low back. This is an oversimplified take, but I do think it's workable, and it's stuff that I had no clue on how to progress when I was stuck in my loop. And so the hip has a lot of functions. It can rotate. There's a ball and socket that we're not even getting deep into. We're just covering the massive tension tug of war that happens from the front of the hips to the back, to the left, to the right. And these are the things that can affect the spine with pelvic tilt, with a hip shift, and everything like that. So we're going to work through 4 major zones of hip mobility. The first being anterior range. And so we're gonna start at the lowest level, which is a couch stretch. We're gonna go in sideways to a wall, put our knee as close as we can to the corner. Most people won't be able to start all the way in there. It'll be too tight, but wherever you can, put the knee in, rotate, bring the free leg around, and most people's starting point is gonna be 2 hands on the ground. I would rather you work from here and then make it an active contraction. Squeeze the glute, squeeze the quad before you try to climb up and start yanking back. So the important thing to know is this entire section of anterior range is going to be opening up the hip flexor, especially the psoas, which goes from the thigh bone up to the front of the spine. So if we start to cheat the range on this and rush through, what we're actually doing is putting excess strain on our spine. We yank back. If my hip flexor can only go right here, there's no more range coming from that muscle today, but I force it, I'm not actually opening up anymore here, I'm just tugging on my spine. And then you see people who do actually tweak their back, stretching out this muscle. So before you start working up, you're gonna find whatever level you're at. 2 hands, 1 hand on the knee, both hands on the knee, then upright. Wherever it is, you're gonna make it active. Squeeze the glute, squeeze the quad, come up tall. You don't need to rush to it. I had nowhere near a starting point as this. I've just been working this one for a long time. Actually, first 7 years ago after knee surgery. But it was like put a timer for 2 minutes and just bear the pain. There was no sort of idea of how to progress. So one thing I've done with all my stretches is tried to make it active. So I try to take my strength training and do it through a large range to get more flexible. And now I take my stretches and I try to contract and actually make it more progressive and more strict. So not letting the back flare, hold up to this standard of getting the shoulders closer to the wall. Up to 2 minutes is a long standard actually. 1 minute is even enough. So 1 minute each side is a great place to start. Once you can handle more, we can take it to something like a split squat, which doesn't need to start at what you see on a flat ground. A lot of people showing. That's awesome. Nobody on earth can really start at this point if they sat in a chair in their life. So a better place to start is foot super elevated, at least a foot off the ground, with the main emphasis of this heel staying on the ground. If we're doing a split squat for the mobility advantage, then we want to be the most strict. Not so much worried about the knee bend. We do want full knee bend, but we're not knee rebuilding. We're trying to open up the almost deepest core muscle in our body. We need to be strict here. We need to be strict with our upright torso, like the couch stretch, not leaning, keeping your ribs down, and then super squeezing on the back leg. So we're gonna go for reps. And now what I do whenever I do this exercise, I only think about the back leg. I squeeze this glute and I squeeze this quad and I stay tall, not leaning back. See, I don't need to think about the front leg because gravity does that. If I'm strict with my form and position, this will naturally bend just to how it's supposed to. I don't need to think about this. But the back leg, if I don't do thought to it, it could go like this. Very different intent, very different result on the hip flexor. So only thinking about squeezing this glute, squeezing this hip flexor, you can start adding weight even before you lower an elevation. That will help you dig in at the bottom. Take a 2-second pause, come up. So working through a few seconds on the way down, 2-second pause. Super productive. Further, we're gonna take this, every exercise I show is gonna show from the most flexible, focused move to then gradually evolving to a more strength-based move. So we started more passive with the couch stretch. Then we went a little bit more loaded with that stretched out hip flexor, the split squat. Now, if we go to something like a reverse Nordic for the third exercise, we're actually completely strengthening the hip flexors at length, taking the qualities we just built and putting it all together. There is definitely no pressure or focus on this. This isn't a direct back builder in the traditional sense, but it is starting to lengthen and put even more tension and pulling on the hip flexors that do attach to the front of the spine. Super challenging. Again, you don't want to lean and do this arch to try to cheat to get the head. That's not the point. And you see people climb out. You should only work up to this, the same process with regression. You could start with a box behind you, and you only go back to a regressed amount. Super, super strict straight body to get the back or shoulders and come back. And then you gradually work to lower and lower levels, so then you can go down without leaning and arching in the back and contracting the hip flexors under stretch. So there's no pressure with that. It's just to show the route from stretching to strength. That's what protection comes along on that spectrum. If we just do mobility for pain relief, that's how you get married to certain movements, but you don't end up waking up out of bed without pain. So the way that we can wake up out of bed and not need 10 minutes of warming up for life is through moves that progressively get more strength-based through a long range of motion. So that's the anterior range for everything that pulls in the front of the spine, starting with the couch stretch, split squat, and then to a reverse Nordic. Step 2, we're at the posterior range. So this is what we traditionally think of as the direct spine mobility. To be able to round forward with the flexed spine does demonstrate a fearless back. That's something that a lot of people, including me, became afraid of with the more re-injury and avoidance that you learn through a chronic back injury. This is something that you want to make sure you're doing alongside the foundation of back training, which is the back extension progressions. I have a video showing that entire journey. If you're not currently working that, you trying to work towards extreme flexion of the spine mobility without the strength demands, it's not going to go very far. You're going to just run into flare-ups and sciatica. So just make sure you're following that progression. You're working through the steps to rebuild your back as we open up from the ankles coming up to the low back in this section. So to start, we're going to go through a stretch in the calf, starting far away from the nerve root. If we have sciatica here in the back, a lot of times, as soon as we start an elephant walk or any sort of flexing, it triggers it right away. Sometimes even lifting the toes can, but if you're able to start a stretch far away from the nerve root, you have that sciatica under control through building the back and the pigeon stretch, you can start to open up the calf and the back of the ankles, which is then going to make it easier to stretch the hamstrings. The general philosophy with this is let's not wait to start stretching the posterior side of the body just because you have nerve pain. That was a huge mistake I made, was thinking I'm just not going to stretch my hamstrings until my sciatica was done. The problem is it wasn't just my hamstrings that ended up getting tight then. It was also the back of my knee, also the calf. So once I did start, as soon as I went for a hamstring stretch, I couldn't even get past my knees because of here. So if we're able to start with just the calf far away from the back, working through a minute each side through the weeks, that's going to be super, super helpful for now when we progress further, as the back is improving with the other work we're doing, to something like the elephant walk. So this is super important to grasp hold of. Elephant walks have been shown a number of times, but I've never seen someone do these progressions to help people with a really sensitive back. you're gonna wanna start before going rounded back, one leg at a time, putting loads of pressure on the SI joint here, which is not bad, just a lot. We wanna start with a hinged back, not rounded, 2 legs at a time. So it's sharing the load and it's not hyper pressurized right here. We're actually still putting a lot to the hamstrings with a flat back. Think of an RDL position, but straight legs. Again, nothing wrong with rounding the back, but the progression can't be just stretching the calves to then complete flex. So the elephant walk will go through steps of 2 legs, hinged back, more emphasis back of the knee hamstrings. Then as we go lower, let's pretend we got a step right here, and then lower, now we're getting to a rounded back. You just can't hinge and go down this low. And as you get more tolerance through the back extension progressions, you can start training one side at a time, which is going to put extra emphasis up above the hamstring, even to the back. And so that very low back section, SI joint, where that integrates, if we start doing one side at a time, we're putting extra load there. When done correctly, that's protective. When done fast, that can be destructive. So that progression is really useful for people. I've seen so many go into their elephant walks, say, it feels amazing. And I just kept doing it, and it started to open up, and then the next day, they were wheelchair bound, had to restart. They were not feeling good. And so slow steps through the elephant walk, leading up to the hottest thing on the internet, partially because I post it too much too, is the Jefferson curl. And let's just roll through what a Jefferson curl is. It's not taking a heavy ass barbell and just rounding our back like a bad deadlift. This is technically a Jefferson curl. Just starting body weight once we've gotten the range with a very intentional flexion through the whole spine. And then coming back up, unwinding. So tucking the chin, getting the cervical spine, the thoracic, the upper back, then the low back. And then in opposite order, unwinding up. The levels you go further, it's just a personal thing. I wanted to see, as a former bad back guy, what sort of strength levels could I reach at something that was a phobia and a severe fear of mine. And so that's how I started loading the Jefferson with the bar, doing Zercher super heavy in videos, is such slow progressions while always building my back extension as my primary. But this actually helped me get insane hamstring flexibility more than just bodyweight stretches. And so the posterior range journey gets debated a whole lot, whether it's useful or not in back pain. And the thing to remember is it's not the whole picture with rebuilding your back, but it is a quality we lose with more fear, more avoidance. We stop rounding forward, we blame the wrong things. So as we fix the tissue, we want to regain that, especially if we want to steer clear of sciatica in the future. All right, now we're at the outer hip, which is super exciting for me because this was a missing link for a long time. If we could see in a picture how the QL attaches to the spine, it's the direct muscle that goes from the iliac crest to the low back. So the pelvis to the back. I had an L5-S1 injury. The L is lumbo, the S is sacrum. So lumbosacral injury, that literally means by definition, that injury was as much back, lumbo, as it was hips, pelvis. The deeper I get into the back world and trying to help people, the more I realize their story aligned with mine, which was back pain accompanied with these hip problems. And so this muscle that directly connects the side of the hips to the spine, you can look at the attachments, it goes directly at every segment of the lower back. We need to work this through strength and then through mobility and then the combination to get evened out left to right on the back and prevent any kind of preference and compensation we get with injury. So the typical move that is a part of this is the pigeon. And we see loads of people showing it, including me, but a missing step we may not see is trying to stretch a muscle that is not strong over and over and over actually leads to that muscle becoming very sensitive and weak. And so there's a lot of people that, because of sciatica, they start doing all sorts of sciatica relief, and they keep cranking on this muscle but not really strengthening it, and it actually leads to something called piriformis syndrome. So they're stretching this muscle over and over and over the weeks, they're not strengthening it, so it actually just becomes stressed out from the stretching, and it doesn't have much protection. And now every time they stretch it, they get temporary relief. The next day, it shrinks up and gets even more contracted and tight as a response of this micro injury. So a missing link, maybe I could have said that a lot quicker, but we need to strengthen the direct area a lot of times to feel a productive stretch. So something I've been working at is, can we get measurable ability on some of the outer hip muscles? The one I found was helpful was a hip internal rotation, to be able to bring up the foot and hold it through these levels gives you a really good stimulus right deep in the hip, that then when we stretch it the opposite way, it's gonna feel way better and conducive to open up. So here's the levels for this hip IR, internal rotation. Is to start, we're gonna have 90 degrees in the front leg, 90 degrees in the back leg, this box. And so level one is both hands outside of this area, lifting for 10 reps. 2-second pause at the top, 10 reps. The level two is one hand out and then the fingers here. You'd be like, well, that doesn't sound like a very progressive step. Try it. That already makes it so much harder to get that foot off. Then level three is to take one palm here and then the palm of your hand here. Both hands on one side of this leg, and then get it up. I can barely, yeah, I got a few reps. And the other side was even worse. I got nothing. I can't even pretend to get it up. And this is the side that I had a lot of the issues on. So working through these levels, I'm still on a journey with it. Getting the outside of the hip stronger measurably. Can't even get one on that third level. Is gonna be huge for when we flip around and then start to stretch it. Starting to get this muscle under a stretch. This is a pretty high angle, so it's not too intense. This may be a starting point for a lot of people who have spent a long time away from this. Okay, so as we work through keeping the direct strength work with the internal rotation, starting to add this stretch.
Okay, so it's become apparent to me during this editing process that due to me wearing shorts 7 sizes too small, I am double cheeked up this entire section. Very embarrassed, almost didn't post it, but YOLO, we're going for it. It's too valuable. I do commit to never buying shorts again from the kids section. I have to do better. I will do better. I apologize.
Working through any difference left to right, contracting, keeping yourself held up through the strength of that glute. We can slowly start to work lower and lower in good increments. Now this is where most people actually start and finish with the hips. And the problem is it can lead to that loop that I described of chasing relief through this exercise. The sciatic nerve, if you look at a picture, runs directly under the piriformis muscle. That's largely what we're stretching out, as well as some of the other outer glute muscles. And just because you're stretching it doesn't mean you're getting stronger and a more resilient tissue. So one thing I do want to talk about is the way we do this. If you're coming at this with someone that may have had a bad back and you're still working through your back extension progressions, I don't really think it's the best to go for a head to foot standard rounding the back. I would rather have you keep your back straight, train this muscle in isolation, and use your body's position to make it more strict. What I mean by that is this. Get into the bench with one hand on top, one hand on the ankle. Now instead of cranking your body to fold and potentially strain your back, keep the back upright right now. This isn't the time to try to do Jefferson curls in your hip stretch. And turn your body, turn your shoulders over that front knee and push this knee into the bench, contracting this hip muscle. So make it active and lift up strong. And now make it a mega strength exercise, an isometric in this stretch. To me, this gave me so much more progress than yanking on a passive limp muscle, trying to get further and further and further, which actually led to a tweak one time for me. I want to segue that actually into how this relates to the QL. The third exercise of the outer hip now actually goes all the way up into the back. Let's look at this anatomy real quick. We have the piriformis and outer glute muscles, which sit on the outside of the hip. They connect all the way up to the iliac crest, which is a fancy word that means the top of the pelvis. Now, directly on the other side of that iliac crest is what muscle? The QL. So this bone on one side is being tugged on by the outer hip and the piriformis. Directly on the other side is the QL. So this is a tug of war sensation where if you don't open up the outside of your hip, now when you try to go into a QL, what's gonna happen is you keep trying to open up your back, but the muscle right below it is so tight, you'll never even it out. So you remember how I showed you the difference of my hips, how I couldn't even lift up that left side? Look what happens when I go on my right side for my QL. Look how deep I get. I can get my fist to the ground. Look at what happens when I go on the side with that hip imbalance of strength. I get nowhere as close. I can barely touch. And I feel crammed in the hips, and I don't feel like I can get nearly as far in the back. But my imbalance starts all the way down in my hips. So that's why I'm working on the strength of my hips on the outer glute, working on the stretch here, because once we start to piece it together on the QL, we want, to strengthen them, but to balance them out. And so my history of a hip shift, having one hip higher than the other, literally walking, squatting, doing everything imbalanced, led to issues above and below. And so even years later, I'm out of pain, still balancing that out. So enough yabbling about that. The form cues on this back extension. You're gonna have to find the right adjustment with your machine, but you don't want it too low where it's on your thighs, or too high where it blocks you. And you're gonna have your free hand up high, and then the hand lowering, reaching for the ground, and it's a curl. So you're gonna open up as much as you can here. This is super important. And then to curl it back in. The difference from an oblique raise and a QL extension is that you're opening up this free side massively. 10 reps on this machine will cook anybody who hasn't been training it. I do want to show the regression on that one. I went a little ahead of myself, but I just wanted to show the concept. Before you even get to that, you need to be working your single leg back extension forward bending for 20 reps. If you're not there yet, put the machine in the closet, grab a weight, and start working the standing version, which is essentially the same, just a lot less weight. So you're gonna have your feet staggered, the leg that's in front, you're gonna slide the weight down, the free hand behind the head. You're gonna slide down, big stretch deep in the back, and pull back. This is an oblique raise. You see this hundreds of times in the gym. This though, massively opening up, is a QL extension. You have to lift and lower to hit the QL. Otherwise, you're gonna hit the outer muscles, the obliques, the transverse abdominis. You need to go super strict. So that's the outer hip progression. Strengthen, stretch, then work above to the QL that locks it all into the spine, even out both sides, 20 reps standing, 10 reps on the back extension. Take your time with this. Okay, finally we're at the last section, which is the outer hip.
Okay, at this point, I'm not even trying to be funny, y'all. This is an educational channel. My best friend behind the camera is an op. He didn't say anything. So these shorts are in the trash.
So this progression, starting with the butterfly, is what finally gave me relief when I would do things such as squatting and deep bending of the hips that gave me SI joint issues. And so this one is a massive, massive importance if you're having any sort of SI joint pain. A lot of that can come from the ability to sit deep in a squat without a butt wink. And that may be a ability that seems irrelevant if you're not a weightlifter, but that will affect even up here the way you walk and twist in the hips. The simplest way to start on this, feet close to you, pulling the toes in, and trying to get your knees as close as you can to the ground. This is my tightest part of my body still. And this was the biggest part of my back pain I couldn't figure out, was the SI joint pain in the back. Pushing with your own pressure or with dumbbells, lightly loading. I like to do 20 reps, working for the knees to the ground, and then at the end, holding a strong contraction. So working through this is a long game, super marathon. Can set you up for the second step. As you're working your back health, we want to start taking that same stretch and now getting flexion at the hips. We're bending the hips with a flat back. So now we're taking length through here and working with a flat back hold. Very active, contract the quads, squeeze tight here. The more we get opened up on the inside of the pelvis, reaching around towards the glutes eventually, the more room you have when you go to squat on the inside and not have any sort of pulling and tugging down in the pelvis. So we go from a butterfly to then a pancake hold, very active. A good standard if you were to test is getting the elbows to the ground. If you can get the head, that's great, but there's no pressure to go extreme on this. I've tweaked this many times, going limp, loosey-goosey, trying to force it. It's way better to hold strict, flat back, contracting. So the combination of those set us up with the butterfly and then starting to take that length with our back going over our hips. Piece that together and we have the seated good morning, which is a major flex of hip ability, but also low back strength. And so this is only to be done after you're hitting your back extension standards. And so I cannot get my knees to the ground on the butterfly stretch. I can't get my stomach to the bench strict on the seated good morning. I've seen it now repeated with many different people. It's like a 1-to-1 ratio. If you can get your knees to the ground on the butterfly, day one of the seated good morning, if their back is strong enough, they'll be able to get their stomach to the bench with an arch in the low back. The same distance I'm away from my knees on the ground with the butterfly is the same distance I'm away here on the seated good morning, about 3 or 4 inches. So I'm still working on my range with this. I actually don't train the seated good morning too much anymore, where I used to try to force it when I didn't have the range. I've seen this one hurt people more than help if they don't have the requirements on the back extension plus the mobility. So I just want to show this concept. Where does the seated good morning play in? You have to be able to hold a low back extension with massive adductor mobility at the same time. The only regression I really do like, if you're pretty close to the bench and you do have a strong back and want to train it, is putting one of these little pads right in front so it'll block short just a bit. That's close enough to where you're in the ballpark of mobility, but it's not fully there. and you can keep the strict arch in the low back. Reach for the stomach, pause, come back up. That has worked with people if they're at that level. All right, that was the longest 10-minute video I've ever made. I get too excited, I apologize, but I know it's gonna help somebody, so I'm gonna put it out. The main takeaway I want you to understand is that mobility is one component of this whole picture of pain-free back ability. It's a crucial component, but you can't just keep stretching every day the same things trying to get the relief and not piece together. You should be strong enough, opened up enough coming out of bed to feel fine. And if not, then we need to take our stretches and make them more into strength training over time. And likewise, maybe take our strength training through a full range of motion and have that be part of flexibility training as well. And so these progressions aren't perfect, but they are very much in line with how I fixed my back after disc herniation, when I was feeling lost, in and out of PT, going through the protocols, not really getting back to sprinting or squatting. So I hope this helps you. I know what it's like to feel stuck. I'm here for you. I hope that I can help even just through content, messages on Instagram, whatever you reach out to me for. If you need further help, we have the Back Breakthrough Blueprint, which is available. That's direct coaching with me through all of these concepts and movements. We're having great success already with it, and I'm just proud to be able to put solutions out exactly where me 3 years ago was at rock bottom. So any questions on that, you can shoot an email to the link in the bio. There's also going to be info there in the description. And yeah, hope this helped. I know it was a lot. Put some in the comment if there's a takeaway or any questions. I'll try to get back to you guys. Keep it going. Peace.